And you're welcome back. In a startling revelation, U.S. Congressman Scott Perry has alleged that the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, has been inadvertently funding terrorist organizations including Boko Haram, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda. During a recent subcommittee hearing, Perry claimed that approximately $697 million annually intended for developmental aid has been misappropriated to support these groups. He highlighted instances where funds earmarked for constructing schools in Pakistan showed zero evidence of completion, raising serious concerns about oversight and accountability within USAID. And now to join us to discuss this further, we're joined by investigative journalist David Hundeyin, who has delved deeper into these allegations, uncovering a complex web of financial mismanagement and corruption. His research suggests that significant sums reportedly allocated for educational and humanitarian projects have been siphoned off, potentially fueling instability and violence in regions like Nigeria. Today's findings have ignited debates about the role of international aid agencies and the unintended consequences of their operations in conflict zones.
Justice Judith says joining us to discuss these pressing issues, David Hundeyin, the investigative journalist who brought these allegations to light, and Auwal Rafsanjani, executive director of the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center. Welcome to the program, guys. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Good. And Rafsanjani is with us as well, I'm hoping. Grand, okay. Now, David, let's start with you. Could you first provide an overview of your investigation into USAID's alleged funding misappropriations and how you uncovered all of this?
So I wouldn't go as far as to call it an investigation. It's just sort of some basic fact-checking that I did. Shortly after the initial set of allegations were made by the U.S. Department of Government Efficiency about financial malfeasance at USAID, I went to the U.S. government platform where you can actually verify what payments are going in and coming out. It's a U.S. Treasury platform. And I paid a special focus to USAID Nigeria, because obviously Nigeria is my key focus is on. And what I noticed, so there were two major things that I noticed. I noticed, first of all, in the lead up to Donald Trump's inauguration, obviously Donald Trump had made it very clear prior to becoming president that one of his priorities would be to slash the foreign aid budget. In the lead up to Donald Trump's inauguration, there were several of these unexplained, significantly large payments that were made to this sort of very nondescript organizations. And then after, I believe it was on January 28th, Donald Trump made he issued the executive order freezing all payments from USAID. And what I noticed with USAID Nigeria is that on January 29 and on January 30, which is the day after and 2 days after the direct instruction of the US president was made, a total of about $466,000 were sent out to recipients by USAID Nigeria. And even worse, the recipients were marked as miscellaneous and undisclosed. So we have close to $500,000. So $466,000 for reference, that's something in the region of 700 million naira, or just under 700 million naira, basically disappearing into a black hole after the US president gave a direct instruction that there had to be no further payments to anybody. 700 million naira is a lot of money in Nigeria. That's a lot of money to just disappear into nothingness. So where is that money going? And this has been a key recurring theme, that a lot of these sort of humanitarian or this sort of nondescript foreign missions that purport to do something in Nigeria and other parts of Africa, it has long been an accusation leveled at them that these people are, in fact, one of the key reasons why there's a lot of instability. There's terrorism and there's the rebel groups and whatnot across Africa. Because if you think about it, where on earth are these groups getting their support from? The context here is that Africa is in terms of economic output, is the world's poorest continent. It has the world's leanest economies. It has the world's poorest people. there is very little to fight over in terms of the actual size of the economy that exists in Africa. And yet, every 10 minutes, there's a new armed group rising out of the dust, out of the woodwork, for no reason in particular. So in the last 6 months alone, even just in Nigeria, we've seen a new one to add to the plethora of the ones that so we have Boko Haram, we have AQIM, we have ISWAP, we have a new one, Lakurawas. It's the same story across the Sahel. It's the same story in East Africa. There's always some M23. There's always a new group coming out of the woodwork to fight over the nothing that we have. And these new groups are always very suspiciously well-armed, well-funded. They have incredible logistical support networks. If you recall, there was a time when Boko Haram was actually physically holding territory, and the Nigerian military could not enter. Something similar happened in Mali, where there was a period where fully half, or more than half of Mali's territory was being held by these, Islamists in the Sahel. So where on earth does it happen that these sort of, flip-flop wearing semi-literate people suddenly get such logistical capacity and such training to be able to go toe-to-toe with, with battle-hardened national militaries? For all of the Nigerian military's failings, the Nigerian military is actually one of the most engaged militaries in Africa. They're quite battle-hardened. So how is it possible that these groups come up out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden they can go toe-to-toe? They have equipment that the Nigerian military doesn't have. More recently, we've seen reports that they have drones. They have military drones. For reference, even the type of connection you need to run a military drone, it's not a mobile internet connection you used to do it. It's not Airtel or MTN that you used to use. You need a satellite connection for that. So how are separatist groups in Sahel having access to satellite connection? Where is this? This is a very expensive endeavor. So where exactly is that money coming from? And I think we're starting to see the answer now. That it's no longer just an accusation. It's no longer just circumstantial. That a U.S. congressman has basically come out and said it, and he's citing documents that basically...
It's given more credit to the entire situation, hasn't it?
Yes, indeed. I mean, let's come to you, Auwal. I mean, from a civil society perspective, what are the implications of these allegations for Nigeria's security as well as trust in international aid?
Mr. Rafsanjani?
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Rafsanjani, that was directed to you.
Okay. Yeah, well, for us, we are not surprised. This is something that has been going on over, decades. Some countries that they regard themselves as powerful and that they must control the economic and political space in Africa, they have deployed strategy this time around not to do direct colonialism, but to do it indirectly by sponsoring this kind of not only faceless but even very faceless groups to sustain their control and their influence, while the citizens suffer from the violence attack from these terror groups, which they actually formed and sponsored. At the same time, they will be siphoning the resources of these countries. And that's exactly what we have been witnessing over the years in many of the African countries where you have incidents of terror groups. There's a history behind this sponsorship or this exposure that the congressman in America had made. As a matter of fact, it's not a hidden secret that the State Department actually is, responsible for many of these groups that emerge. For example, if you look at the terror groups in the Al-Qaeda, for example, Al-Qaeda was funded and formed by the allegedly by the State Department. You remember, Osama bin Laden was actually trained and sponsored by the State Department. It was only when they began to disagree that they now call them terrorists or they now call them terror. So I think if you look at various groups that the West support to carry out arms. They are actually, highly funded by these Western countries simply because they want to have control of their economy. Mm-hmm. They want to make sure that they continue to extend their colonialism, through the use of terror groups. So we are not surprised as civil society that this, exposure, was compounded by a congressman in America. But what actually surprised us was the fact that the Nigerian military or the Nigerian authority, despite the intelligence that they have, they could not be able to know this and then be able to even rise up and demand for the continuation of this sponsorship of terror group. So apparently, the Nigerian military, they were just enjoying spending trillions of naira in the names of buying arms and ammunition, what we do not even see it in terms of safety and protection of the citizens.
Okay, then, Mr. Rafsanjani.
For me, I'm not really surprised as a civil society. I'm not surprised. It is something that we know has been going on. Only that our own government have not been proactive to ensure that they raise the necessary concern over it.
Well, Mr. Rafsanjani, the next question is how pervasive is this corruption and what direction is it coming from? Are we saying that, well, organizations like USAID are the corrupt ones, or does it become corrupt after they've handed it over to authorities here in Nigeria? Where does the corruption start? Are they aware that they are funding insurgency, or is it taken over from the Nigerian side once these funds are made available to the agencies here in Nigeria?
So I'm not sure if it is the USAID funding, but rather the State Department, because the USAID, most of its funding, you could see that it is more of like a development project. Not really, working directly, between government to government. It is very important to note that this kind of funding, is directly from the State Department, not from the necessarily USAID. USAID focuses more on issues around health, around education, around maybe other issues that has to do with the community support. But a major project like sponsoring terror groups, I think it doesn't come from the USAID funding, but rather from the State Department, or from any relevant American institutions that they do that. And for me, the congressman is making this statement maybe because they really needed to justify why USAID has to be scrapped. Otherwise, for the past 10 years, he has been in the US Congress, and he hasn't raised this. So for me, actually, is even though he has actually said the truth that they are the one sponsoring terror group, but he could have made this in, when 10 years back when he has been in the Congress. So he has not made that, this linking it to USAID. For me, I do not think that it is funded with the facts and evidence, but rather maybe funding from the State Department or from directly other US, related funding. Nigeria and the United States of America have what they call bilateral. So there's bilateral relation that supports Nigeria with either weapons or training or intelligence. So I think invariably I believe that it is because the Nigeria is also sleeping. That is why we have experienced this kind of thing without being noted or without being action being taken. I think it is a clerical call for the Nigerian government to be more serious about how they engage with the multinational cooperation or diplomatic relation that they have. We have submitted ourselves to like a second-hand citizens.
All right. Well, Mr. Rafsanjani, we are aware that you're in transit, so we'll let you go now, but thank you very much for your contribution here this morning. We'll continue with David Hundeyin.
Yes, David. You just listened to Mr. Auwal's submission there regarding mechanisms and just basically how whether or not, whether the funds are being misappropriated or diverted. One thing is certain, we also bear the brunt of the blame when it comes to their meddling with our affairs. Do you agree with Mr. Rafsanjani?
I agree with him partially. I agree with him in the sense that the State Department obviously plays a leading role in directing and coordinating the sort of strategic stabilization of African countries, including Nigeria. Where I absolutely and totally disagree with him is the idea that USAID is somehow innocent in all of this. Obviously, he comes from the civil society space in Nigeria, which is largely funded by USAID and its affiliates. So I can understand why, maybe out of some sense of solidarity, he doesn't want to sort of throw his colleagues under the bus. However, if you've been following the story and if you've been following the characters involved in the story, it's very clear that USAID has at least as much involvement as the State Department does. Because how this works is that, unlike the State Department, which is obviously subject to Congress, or the CIA, which is subject to the President, CIA needs approval from the President to carry out any operation. USAID was not established by an act of Congress and doesn't need permission from the President. So it's basically a law unto itself. And the budget for USAID is more than that of the CIA and the State Department put together. It's between $40 and $50 billion annually. So essentially, the USAID functions as the sort of slush fund of the U.S. intelligence community. This has been very well established if you've been following figures like Mike Pence, who has been doing a lot of great expository work about this. He used to work at the State Department. So basically, the USAID is the big slush fund. And how money is moved to terrorists or separatists or whatever is that it's done in plain sight, right? Unlike maybe the CIA or the State Department who do covert things, but they do it directly. What USAID will do is that they will say that they're funding some organization that I don't know, feeds hungry children somewhere in northern Nigeria, and they'll fund it with $10 million. And when you go onto the ground, you realize that if not even a fraction of that money made it there, right? But where that money actually made it to was the bad actors in question. That is how, that is the true extent of USAID involvement in this story. And that's not my opinion. That's what the Americans themselves are revealing. Obviously, this is happening because of a political dispute in Washington, D.C. The current occupants are trying to purge the influence of the previous occupants, which is why everybody's bringing out everybody's secrets now. It's not as if they didn't know this before. So obviously we know that they're not doing this out of the sincerity of their hearts or because anybody has any interest in fighting terrorism or whatnot. We know they're doing it just to discredit the Democrats. But at the end of the day, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth, right? If something which, I mean, as at 2009, we were not visually familiar with the concept of terror as a Nigerian thing. Terrorism didn't exist in 2009. And just 4 years later, by 2013, terrorism was an everyday headline in Nigeria. We've been very harshly, very rudely, and very violently brought into this world that we're not familiar with. And that has happened through the actions of American administrations, primarily Democrats. So if it happens that you then have this sort of wrecking ball sort of administration in power now that is not even Republican in the conventional sense, basically just want to burn everything down, out of some sense of vengeance or whatever, you should take it because that's in our favor, right? If our problem or one of our biggest problems is that we have this huge 800-pound gorilla that is sponsoring instability in our region and making it impossible for us to grow. And now that gorilla is having internal issues and all these things are becoming exposed. That gives us a window of opportunity to do what needs to be done. So I completely disagree with Mr. Rafsanjani in his attempt to sort of extricate USAID from this issue because USAID is front and center.
David, isn't that kind of justified when you think about the jobs that is created? I mean, with its good comes its bad as well, but there's been some level of good to it, and those are people's jobs and livelihoods. You know, there are CSOs who's benefited from USAIDs, there are people who have been employed under this scheme, you know, and I mean, if he tries to extricate himself, doesn't he have a right to do that?
Well, if USAID is responsible for funding, for creating the instability in the first place, and then they are sort of treating the symptoms, you know, or making some cursory, you know, pretense at treating the symptoms, but they are the ones who are behind it in the first place, then they are not, their presence is not helping. If I stick a needle into your neck and I'm siphoning off your blood, right, and you're slowly dying, and then at the same time I'm feeding you vitamins and nutrients and fruits so that you stay alive and you keep producing blood, right, I can claim that I'm the one keeping you alive because I'm feeding you, but I'm also the one killing you. So the solution is not for me, is not for the status quo to remain. The solution is for me to take the needle out so that whether I'm feeding you or not makes no difference to you. That's what USAID needs to do in Nigeria. They need to leave us alone.
All right, now, David.
And we will sort out whatever issues that we have.
David, let's look at the why. In your submission, you use very interesting words that I found very interesting. By the way, don't look at a gift horse in the mouth. Totally describes the situation. However, you mentioned nondescript organizations here in Nigeria that have perhaps maybe received certain funds from these agencies outside of the country, in this case USAID. You spoke of $700 million, is it dollars or naira, that vanished into thin air? And I think the word you used was strategic destabilization. Why exactly would they want to destabilize the Nigerian economy? What are we giving back to them? What are they gaining from us being destabilized?
So again, you don't have to take my word for it, because I realize that when I say these things, a lot of the time it sounds like these are my theories. So I think people need to, for example, read up on the so-called Kissinger report or the Kissinger doctrine, which is still available online. This was basically the background for American foreign policy for Africa, which was formulated sometime in the 1970s when Henry Kissinger was U.S. Secretary of State, and it still forms the basis for U.S. policy, for U.S. foreign policy on Africa. It has not changed since then. So you can read that document. You can also read up on I believe the fellow that I referenced earlier, Mike Benz, who used to work at the State Department. There's a good video series he's been putting out recently. One of those videos, he talked about a CIA training manual, which came across, and he actually put up the manual. You can actually download it, where a fictional West African country called Nairobi, whose capital is called Ajuba. Draw your conclusions from that. And it's basically a training manual for how the CIA could hypothetically stage a crisis in that country for the sole purpose of disrupting the construction of Chinese infrastructure, because the idea is that continued construction of Chinese-funded infrastructure draws that big West African country into the economic and political ambit of China and reduces American influence in the region. It's very important for people to understand how the U.S. foreign policy establishment sees the world. It does not see the world as a place where human beings live, and you know, this is where your children are living and dying. This is where your hopes and dreams exist. It sees the world primarily in terms of resource potential and in terms of who is friendly and who is hostile, who is useful and who is not. All right. So according to this Kissinger doctrine, it forms the basis for U.S. foreign policy on Africa. Africa has a very specific role in global economy and in geopolitics. The economic role is that it's to be the place where you get cheap industrial inputs. So that's cheap cash crops, cheap energy reserves like crude oil, uranium, whatnot, cheap solid minerals, and it's also to be a place where you get cheap human labor if it's needed.
So David.
So nowhere in that doctrine is there a space for an Africa which has a large population that uses its own resources, that has an industrial economy, and that exists at the same level as maybe North America, Europe, and Asia. There's no space for that in that U.S. foreign policy doctrine. So it therefore follows logically that if you are the foreign policy establishment in charge of executing that doctrine, your key focus will be to ensure that that part of the world that is meant to remain the place with hewers of wood and drawers of water cannot be stable.
Well,
Those people cannot have 10 uninterrupted years of peace.
So who do we have to thank for this? I asked that first, then I'm going to apply this. In his first term, Donald J. Trump was seen as a tyrant, was seen as, he was seen as a villain by most of Africa. Now, if we have these events unfolding and we have us in Nigeria here looking for accountability, are we now changing his status from villain to hero? Does he mean well for Africa? Is that why he is cutting these agencies and cutting these fundings to help us, perhaps, do you think?
No, he absolutely does not mean well for Africa. But as I said, he has an agenda which happens to align with that of Africa. I don't think Donald Trump can place most African countries on the map. He probably thinks we're only about the resource monkeys on this continent, to be honest. However, it just so happens that as a result of the manner in which he was forced out of office last time, he believes the election was stolen from him, and also as a result of what was done to him during the 4 years where he was out of power. People often forget he was dragged through several court processes and legal processes. He had the police mugshot. To the best of my knowledge, he's the first U.S. president in the modern era to have a police mugshot taken of him, right? And then he also believes that they tried to kill him twice, which, I mean, you do have to say it is quite curious that someone that heavily guarded, some untrained kid somewhere was able to put a bullet within a few centimeters of his head. So he believes that this deep state, this secret state, right, which is the same as this foreign policy establishment in the U.S., he believes that they are his enemy. So which is why they have been his key focus. All of the key institutions in that deep state, he has gone after all of them. He's gone after the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, which is the main vehicle for foreign regime change operations. He's gone after USAID, which is basically the piggy bank for all these operations that happen, with or without presidential approval. He's gone after, there was this other major one he went after. He's put Marco Rubio in charge of the State Department, which is going to severely whittle the amount of influence that he has, and he's basically cut funding. The reason he's so specific about cutting funding is not really because he cares about efficiency and whatnot. To be honest, the foreign policy budget of the US is 1% of the federal budget. It's not that much money in American terms. The reason he's going after it so specifically is that he's trying to defund the people he thinks are his enemies. And that just so happens to align spectacularly with what we need from US foreign policy. So which is why I said we should see it as an opportunity and don't look a gift horse in the mouth. It doesn't mean Donald Trump is a good person. It doesn't mean he's a hero. It doesn't mean he likes Africa. He definitely doesn't. But we'll take it.
Right. David, I have to ask you, in all of this, there's one thing, there's an element that I think that we need to, try to focus on, and that's Nigeria and our lack of intelligence or the presence of none, or if there is in any sense, because this has been going on since what, 2014 or thereabout, and the terrorism group have metamorphosed over the years to what we now see it as Rawa, right? And so it begs to ask the question how this funding have slipped under the radar that from one administration to another and now the third have not been able to flag this, and our the head of defense, chief of defense staff, plus all the chief heads and the National Security Advisor have not been able to flag this, or the individuals who are in cahoots with USAID to have gotten to this point?
So I just want to correct the impression that the Nigerian intelligence infrastructure and the security establishment is not aware, or they've not been aware. They have been aware for at least 10 years. Money cannot come into Nigeria or flow within Nigeria, and they don't know. They do know. The problem is that the sheer quantum of money that is involved here makes it very easy in the Nigerian context for people to have their loyalties tested and for people to look the other way when they really shouldn't. That is the key problem. And I can say this authoritatively because based on my own interactions with people in that space, and also based on my interactions with people in the civil society space, I know for a fact that none of this is news to many actors in those spaces. They are very well aware of what is happening and the role that they are deliberately or inadvertently playing. But what you will hear from them is, at the end of the day, man must jump. Mm-hmm. That's I think the tragedy of the Nigerian condition, where you know that something is being done to you and to your people, and you know that hundreds of thousands of people are dying as a result of this thing that is being done. But all you can see is what little localized benefits you are getting out of it. So because you get to drive a nice car, you get to live in a nice part of town in Abuja, you get to travel the world, and you get to have this little, petite bourgeoisie lifestyle, that is worth hundreds of thousands of people in the Northeast dying anonymously, just so that you can have this little pretense of comfort, while the country continues to implode around you, and while the inflation keeps inching and creeping closer to you, while you cover your eyes and pretend that it's not happening. That is the case with the CSO establishment. That's the case with the security establishment. That's especially the case with the intelligence establishment, which is, they know this in greater detail than any of us who is speaking here does. They do. They just can't. They just refuse to act on it because everybody has a vested interest here or there, and it's very unfortunate.
Right, very unfortunate indeed. And just finally, before I let you go, right, what particularly were like the red flags or patterns that sort of points to, that we have overlooked for too long? Some red flag or pattern that, I mean, in your course of just, looking at this and just seeing how this has played out and just being very invested in this situation, what were some patterns and red flags that even the ordinary Nigerian or even the media just didn't see?
So let me read out a portion from, this was part of a USAID budget, I believe, from 2023. And these are just some random line items, just to create some context. So $10 million for voluntary medical male circumcision in Mozambique. $9.7 million for University College Berkeley, California, to develop a cohort of Cambodian youth with enterprise-driven skills. $2.3 million for strengthening independent voices in Cambodia. $14 million for gender equality and women empowerment hub. $14 million for improving public procurement in Serbia. $486 million to the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strength. So these are all line items that mean absolutely nothing. These are extremely vague descriptions that do not give you any information about where this money is going, who it is going to, and what it is going to be used for. These are vague descriptions. So if you were a banker and you were seeing transfers in these sums, and these were the descriptions, as a compliance officer in a bank, you will not be doing your job if you didn't flag these, because these have all sorts of money laundering red flags, right? So
right.
if your job was to counter money laundering and terror financing, these are the things that you would look at. However, because it's coming from a U.S. government institution, you convince yourself that you have to look the other way, and obviously you may also have some vested interest. So I think that's what has been happening, because the red flags have been there in plain sight. This is money laundering on an epic scale, right? Because Nigeria is mentioned in that budget too, and you have hundreds of millions of dollars. In 2023, for example, supposedly USAID spent $823 million in Nigeria.
Hang on a second, David.
We actually don't know.
David, hang on a second. Where does the responsibility lie? Does it lie with USAID to actually check on where the monies are going, or the Nigerian authorities to see where they might be spent at? Where does it lie exactly? Who's to blame when it comes to these monies disappearing? Who didn't do their due diligence to follow the trail?
It's definitely the Nigerian government's responsibility, because again, it's not a case of USAID making a mistake or just money just innocently going missing. These are bad actors. These are things that are deliberately done intentionally to conceal bad faith actions. So it's the responsibility of the victim to ensure that they are not victimized. So it's the Nigerian government's responsibility to ensure that Nigerian lives and hopes and dreams are protected in a world where some people have written a foreign policy doctrine somewhere that Africans are supposed to be poor and miserable, and that we're not supposed to, our population is not supposed to thrive, right? It's the Nigerian government's responsibility as the government of the most populous African nation in existence to ensure that through its own enforcement and monitoring actions, it makes it impossible for anybody who has such views to actually actualize them on the ground. So ultimately, that's where the buck stops. The buck stops in Aso Rock.
Yeah, but David, aren't you said it's the responsibility of the victim to work towards not being victimized. Aren't you victim shaming and blaming? That's a rhetorical question. I was trying to make a joke. But you made mention of the line items and saying that they were quite vague, and whoever's doing this bulk transfers, should have been able to flag them. And that takes me to the Financial Crimes Commission, not necessarily EFCC, but the unit that is for the bank. I think it's called the NFIU, which is the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit, which is supposed to flag issues like this and raise it up to either the EFCC or the National Advisor, the National Security Advisor. It makes me wonder whether or not, you know, these units are seeing them as flagging them, or if they just sweep it under the carpet or take it at face value. And so it takes me to also my other question of to identify who this money are being transferred to. I know USAID is the entirety of Africa, but specifically for Nigeria, with those line items and those transfers, those coming to Nigeria, were you able to identify who these organizations are, these individuals are, or CSOs?
As far as USAID goes, not really, because again, these are the best people in the world at hiding financial flows, at, you know, concealing the true destination of such things. However, what I will also mention with regard to the NFIU and the EFCC is that I've had interactions with them previously. So I remember in 2022, I was part of a team that did, we gained access to a database of payments from a Qatari charity that has been linked to terror financing around the world. It's called E-Charity. That's EID, E-Charity. And, you know, I was contacted. So this group was based in Washington. So they contacted me because Nigeria was mentioned in the report. And I extracted the data for Nigeria, and I established that between, I believe it was 2007 to 2022, that nothing less than $12 million had been funneled from this terror-linked Qatari charity to this completely anonymous entity in Nigeria called Al-Qaeda Foundation. Right, completely anonymous entity, doesn't have CAC registration, doesn't appear to. The only proof that it exists is a signboard somewhere in Ibadan saying Al-Qaeda Foundation and this tiny little one-story house. So it's incredible that $12 million would have been funneled to a one-story house somewhere in Ibadan over the course of more than a decade, and nobody knew about it. And this thing doesn't even have CAC registration. So I reached out to the EFCC spokesperson, David Hundeyin, and I also reached out to the NFIU before I published the story to get their comments that this is a very clear-cut case of terror finance, and this is a terror financing pipeline. You have payment details here, you have, you know, this is cast iron information. What are you going to do about it? And I didn't even get a response to my emails, my WhatsApp messages. They just completely blanked me. So in EFCC's case, David Hundeyin actually read my message because I sent him a message on WhatsApp. I saw the double blue tick, so he read my message and he completely ignored me till today as we speak. So that gives you an idea of what our institutions think of as enforcement, really. I guess if it's not a politically sensitive issue, or maybe the president hasn't ordered them to do something, then they're just not going to do anything.
All right. Well, David, I want to say thank you very much for following the paper trail. Oh, by the way, is that a white wall behind you? Is it a wall, what we can see?
Yes.
Oh,
yes, it is.
Next time we come to you, please have a picture on it, okay? Just something to tell us a bit about.
I'll try.
Thank you very much, David. Always a pleasure having you on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.